Leonard Scar, please leave the burial account packet on the table. These accounts go back years. Some of them are complicated. The allegation is that pre-need money was not deposited where it belonged. Families change plans, contracts, records move.
There are two versions of Leonard Scar. The third-generation funeral director his Suffern community trusted with their most vulnerable moments, and the man on the federal indictment who forged a death certificate to steal from a customer who was still alive. Both are the same person.
Supposed to stay in trust until the customer died. You're making funeral house paperwork sound like theft.
The confrontation ends. The paperwork does not. Because Leonard Scar had done something that even the veteran investigators from the Rockland County District Attorney's Office had never seen documented in a pre-need fraud case in New York State. He had forged a death certificate in the name of a customer who was still alive and walked it into a bank in Suffern, New York to withdraw the money that customer had set aside for her own funeral. 89 victims. $531,000. A century-old family business built by his grandfather in 1920. A father who had served as the town's mayor. All of it, over the next decade, would be sold, forfeited, and dismantled to make 89 grieving families whole. Before we go any further, I have to ask something. Have you ever paid for something in advance and just trusted that the person you handed the money to was going to honor the contract? A layaway, a deposit, a pre-need account like the ones in this case. Drop it in the comments and tell me what you paid for and whether you got what you were promised. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel doesn't let stories like this get buried under whatever's trending. We cover accountability every week without exception. Leonard Allen Scar was born in Suffern, New York, in the winter of 1968, in the same Hudson Valley village where his family name had already been carved into the town's civic memory for 2 generations. Suffern sits at the edge of Rockland County, 30 miles northwest of Manhattan, close enough to feel the pull of the city, and far enough that everyone in the village still knew everyone else by first name. In 1968, the population was under 8,000 people. It has barely grown since. His grandfather, the first Leonard Scar, had founded Scar Funeral Home on Lafayette Avenue in 1920, back when the village still had trolley lines, and the funeral trade was one of the few professions in a small town that could not be outsourced, undercut, or replaced. When Leonard was born, the funeral home had been operating for 48 years. When he was a child, it had been the family's identity for nearly half a century. His father, the second Leonard A. Scar, ran the business through the 70s and 80s. He was more than the village undertaker. In 1985, Scar's father was elected mayor of Suffern, a position he would hold until 1989. In a village that small, being mayor was not a career. It was a courtesy the town paid to families who had already been trusted with everything else. Weddings, funerals, the signing of 100 death certificates a year. When Leonard's father shook a resident's hand at the 4th of July parade on Lafayette Avenue, he had likely buried at least one of that resident's parents. That was the profile the Scar family carried through 3 generations. It was the profile Leonard inherited. He grew up inside the funeral home, not near it, inside it. The family lived on the 2nd floor, above the chapel and the preparation rooms. His childhood bedroom was 1 flight of stairs above the embalming table. He learned to be quiet during services, the way other children learned to be quiet in church. He knew the difference between a wake and a viewing before he could ride a bicycle. He attended Suffern High School, played on the junior varsity soccer team, and graduated in 1986. His yearbook quote referenced his father's mayoral term and joked that he was already planning to run for something. He was voted most likely to inherit the family business. Most of the class thought that was a lock. Most of the class was right. After high school, Leonard enrolled in the mortuary science program at the American Academy McAllister Institute in Manhattan, one of the oldest funeral service schools in the country. He commuted from Suffern on the New Jersey Transit Port Jervis line, an hour each way, carrying textbooks on embalming chemistry, restorative art, and funeral service law. His instructors described him in evaluations as polished, well-mannered, and clearly comfortable with the material. One instructor noted that he carried the calm demeanor that clients respond to during their worst days. He passed his state board examinations on the first attempt in 1989 and returned to Suffern to work alongside his father. For the next 15 years, Leonard worked as an associate under his father. He directed his first solo funeral in 1991. He was licensed by New York State as a funeral director in 1992. He got married in 1994 in a ceremony at the Suffern Presbyterian Church, 4 blocks from the funeral home. He and his wife bought a colonial on Chestnut Street. In 2004, when his father formally retired, Leonard Scar, the third Leonard Scar, took over as the owner and chief executive of Scar Funeral Home. He was 36 years old. He was the third generation. He was, at that moment, one of the most trusted people in Suffern, New York. He had inherited 84 years of accumulated small-town trust. He had inherited a client list that included half the village, and he had inherited signatory authority over every single pre-need burial account the family business held in escrow. That authority was about to be tested. To understand what Leonard Scar did over the next 16 years, you have to understand a piece of New York state law that most people never think about until it is too late. It is called the pre-need funeral account. It is one of the most fiduciarily sensitive escrow arrangements the state regulates, and its enforcement mechanism is almost entirely honor-based. A pre-need funeral account works like this. A customer, usually elderly, walks into a funeral home and sits down with the director. They select the services they want at the end of their life: a casket, a viewing, a graveside service, music, flowers, cars. They agree on a price. They write a check or a series of checks for that amount. The funeral home is then required, under New York state law, to deposit that money into an interest-bearing escrow account within 10 working days. The money is not the funeral home's. It cannot be touched. It sits in the account, earning interest, until the customer dies and the contracted services are actually rendered. Only at that point can the funeral home withdraw the funds. The purpose of the account is exactly what it sounds like. It relieves grieving families of the financial burden of funeral planning at the moment of grief. Elderly customers use it to spare their children. Couples use it to spare each other. It is one of the most emotionally freighted financial products a small business handles. New York's regulatory framework requires 3 specific documentation steps. First, the 10-day deposit window into an interest-bearing account. Second, a receipt issued to the customer within 30 business days of payment. Third, annual account statements sent to the customer showing account balance and accrued interest. On paper, the architecture is airtight. In practice, all 3 requirements depend on one thing. They depend on the funeral home director choosing to comply with them. There is no real-time external audit. There is no automated deposit tracker. There is no state auditor showing up on the 10th business day to verify that the check was deposited. The New York State Department of Health, which regulates funeral directors, relies almost entirely on customer complaints to trigger investigations. If the customer does not know their money was never deposited, and the funeral home never sends the required annual statement, and the customer dies before anyone asks a question, the fraud can run forever without detection. Scar understood the architecture. He knew, better than the customers who trusted him with their retirement savings, exactly which requirements had teeth and which requirements had none. He had grown up watching his father run the same accounts under the same regulations. He knew that the 10-day deposit rule was enforced by the funeral home's own honesty and by nothing else. Between 2004 and 2010, there is no indication that Scar abused any pre-need account. The business ran as it had for 80 years. He buried the parents of his high school classmates. He handled the funerals of the residents his father had once served as mayor. He was described in a local paper's business feature in 2008 as the quiet, steady presence at one of Suffern's oldest institutions. Then something changed. What exactly changed inside Leonard Scar's finances or personal life at the beginning of 2010 has never been fully explained on the public record. What is known is that in April of 2010, For the first time in the family business's 90-year history, a customer's pre-need payment was accepted, receipted, and never deposited into an escrow account. It was spent by Leonard Scarr, personally, within days. That was the first one. It would not be the last. The scheme unfolded over the next 10 years and 4 months, April of 2010 to August of 2020, 124 months, 89 identified victims, $531,071.37, taken one pre-need contract at a time. The mechanism was almost embarrassingly simple. It required no forgery for most of the theft, no sophisticated financial engineering, no offshore accounts. It required only that Leonard Scarr, when a customer wrote him a check for their own future funeral, walk that check to his own personal account instead of to the escrow account the law required. The paperwork was the disguise. Scarr would sit with the customer in the pre-need consultation office, walk them through the price sheet, calculate the cost of the services they had selected, and present a signed contract that appeared to establish exactly the escrow arrangement New York state law required. The contract listed the amount, the services, the terms, and the account. Customers went home with the contract and believing the money was safely deposited. In many cases, no deposit was ever made. The interest-bearing escrow account named in the contract either did not exist or was never funded. The victim would receive the paperwork the law required, and no more. The receipt within 30 business days. Then nothing. No annual statement, no account balance letter, no accrued interest report, because there was no account to send statements from. But customers rarely noticed. Elderly clients who had paid for their own funerals did not typically call the funeral home the following year to ask about the interest accrual on their burial fund. They went about their lives trusting that the arrangement was in place and waiting in the way that people who have arranged for their own funerals wait for a day that felt very far off. In 27 separate instances documented by prosecutors, Scarr took more than $3,000 from a single victim. In 6 other instances, he took more than $1,000. On 33 documented occasions, he simply never made the deposit at all. He used the funds, prosecutors would later prove, for personal expenses. Not investments, not business expansion, not the modernization of the century-old facility on Lafayette Avenue. Personal expenses. The exact spending pattern would emerge from the forensic accounting later, but investigators would describe it as domestic, ordinary, and continuous. The money did not leave Suffern. It funded the day-to-day life of the third-generation funeral director everyone in the village already trusted. Then there was the escalation, the one that would define the case in the public imagination for the rest of Leonard Scarr's life. Somewhere in the middle years of the scheme, Scarr set up a pre-need escrow account correctly for one customer, a living woman. She had walked into the funeral home the way hundreds of others had. She had selected her services. She had written her check. And for reasons known only to Leonard Scarr, that particular check was deposited exactly where the law required, into an interest-bearing escrow account at a Rockland County bank in the customer's name. For that customer, the system worked. Until Scarr decided he wanted the money, he could not, under the account architecture, simply withdraw the funds. The account was structured to be inaccessible until the customer's death triggered the contracted services. The bank required documentation. Specifically, it required a death certificate. So, Leonard Scarr, third-generation funeral director in Suffern, New York, produced one. He forged a death certificate in the name of a customer who was still alive. He walked it into the bank. He presented it to a bank representative who had no reason to doubt him, because he was Leonard Scarr, of the Scarr family, of Scarr Funeral Home, whose grandfather had helped anchor the village. The bank processed the documented death. The escrow funds were released. Leonard Scarr walked out with the money. The customer, at that moment, was alive. She was going about her day. She would remain alive throughout the theft. She would remain alive throughout the investigation. She would remain alive when the indictment came down. She would remain alive at the sentencing. Nobody at the bank called to check. For a second victim, Scar contracted to establish a pre-need account and then did not establish it at all. He wrote up the paperwork. He accepted her check. He filed the contract. And the account on the bank's end never came into existence. Her money sat in his personal account, and then in the personal spending category, and then it was gone. That woman would later stand in a Rockland County courtroom and describe the man she had trusted for 30 years. She would call Leonard Scar, on the record, a dear friend. She would remind the judge that Scar had buried her father and many members of her husband's family, and that she had walked into his funeral home to arrange for her own funeral because she knew him, because everyone in Suffern knew him, because his father had been the mayor. That was the trust Leonard Scar exploited systematically for a decade. The break, when it came, did not come from a state regulator. It did not come from the New York Department of Health. It did not come from an annual audit. It came from the mechanism that always breaks these cases open eventually. It came from the customers themselves. By the summer of 2020, 10 years into the scheme, the pre-need contracts Scar had signed in the earliest years of the fraud were starting to mature. Elderly customers were dying. Families were coming into the funeral home with the paperwork from 2010, from 2012, from 2014. Contracts their loved ones had signed. Contracts that referenced escrow accounts and account balances and services paid for in full. And the families, going through the arrangements at the worst moments of their lives, began asking questions the funeral home director could no longer smoothly answer. Where was the account statement? What bank held the escrow? Why had no interest been credited in 10 years? Some families accepted the answers he gave. Others did not. Some walked out of the funeral home confused and called their attorneys. A few called the Rockland County District Attorney's Office. A few more called the Ramapo Police Department. And at some point during the summer of 2020, in the offices of the Rockland County District Attorney's Office, the small complaints began to line up in a way that stopped looking like small complaints and started looking like a pattern. Rockland County District Attorney Tom Walsh assigned the case to a joint investigation with the Ramapo Police Department Detective Bureau. Ramapo is the township that contains the village of Suffern, and its Detective Bureau has the jurisdictional reach to work the county-level financial crimes that state agencies do not typically have the resources to pursue. Investigators subpoenaed Scar Funeral Home's bank records. They pulled the pre-need contract files. They interviewed victims and family members, one at a time, through the summer and into the fall of 2020. The pattern was there in the paperwork. Contracts referencing escrow accounts that had never been opened, deposits that had never been made, annual statements that had never been sent, and, in one file, the paper trail that would define the entire case, a death certificate, filed in the name of a woman investigators found when they went to interview her, at home, alive, sitting at her kitchen table, wondering why detectives from the Rockland County District Attorney's Office wanted to speak with her about a document that officially declared her deceased. That interview was the moment the investigation stopped being a pre-need fraud case and became something else, something that would carry the public's attention through indictment, plea, and sentencing. We're heading into the investigation and the courtroom now. Before we do, if this story has held your attention this long, that is because it deserves to be told properly. Subscribe if you agree. This channel covers cases that do not get the coverage they deserve every single week. The Rockland County District Attorney's Office and the Ramapo Police Department worked the case for the balance of 2020. Detectives interviewed every identified pre-need customer they could locate. They cross-referenced funeral home contracts against bank records. They mapped the 10-year timeline. And they built, piece by piece, the aggregate loss figure that would eventually define the prosecution, $531,071.37, 89 identified victims. The initial indictment referenced 90. The final restitution architecture identified 88. The number moved slightly as investigators added and confirmed victims through the prosecution, but the aggregate was consistent. Roughly 90 families in a village of 8,000 people had been defrauded by the third-generation family business their parents and grandparents had trusted. The forensic accounting was straightforward once the subpoenas hit. Bank records showed the pattern investigators were looking for. Pre-need checks deposited into Scar's personal or operating account. No corresponding transfer to an escrow account. Personal spending downstream. In the 27 cases of individual theft over $3,000, the paper trail led directly from the customer's check to the director's household expenses. In the 6 cases of theft over $1,000, the same pattern held. The 33 occasions of complete non-deposit were documented from the contract files themselves, and then there was the forged death certificate. Investigators recovered the document. They confirmed, against New York State vital records, that no such death had been registered. They interviewed the bank representative who had processed the release of funds. They confirmed that Scar had personally presented the forged certificate. They confirmed that the escrow account had been drained to Scar's benefit on the strength of that document. They confirmed that the customer named on the certificate was, at the time of the release, and at the time of the investigation, and at the time of the eventual sentencing, alive. That single document did more to shape the prosecution's public narrative than any of the other 88 thefts combined. Because grand larceny is a paperwork crime, but a forged death certificate in the name of a living woman is a story. It is the kind of moral fact that carries itself into a courtroom without needing to be explained. In parallel with the criminal investigation, the Rockland County District Attorney's Office made a strategic decision that would shape the case's ultimate resolution. In the fall of 2020, the DA's office filed a civil forfeiture action in Rockland County Supreme Court. The action sought forfeiture of Scar's property and, critically, the proceeds from any sale of Scar Funeral Home itself. The purpose was not punitive, it was structural. The DA's office understood that 89 grieving families in a small village were not going to be made whole by a criminal restitution order alone. Restitution orders can take years to collect. Some are never collected at all. The DA's office wanted the money in an escrow arrangement of its own, under the court's control, before Scar had a chance to spend, hide, or lose any more of it. The civil forfeiture action was the most consequential move in the entire prosecution. It ensured that when the criminal case eventually resolved, the money to make 89 families whole was already there, waiting. The indictment came down in late 2020, more than 100 counts, grand larceny, forgery, scheme to defraud. The paperwork alone ran to hundreds of pages. Investigators had documented every theft, every non-deposit, every misdirected check, and the single forged certificate that would define the case in every newspaper article written about it. Leonard Scar surrendered to Ramapo police. He was fingerprinted, processed, and released. He returned to a funeral home he no longer effectively owned. He walked back into a village that no longer knew what to do with the third generation of the family, whose name was carved into the stone above the front door. The moment that would be replayed on every local news broadcast covering the case happened on the porch of Scar Funeral Home on a weekday morning in the fall of 2020. Detectives from the Ramapo Police Department arrived with the arrest warrant. 2 vehicles pulled up to the driveway on Lafayette Avenue. Scar came to the door in a dark suit. He had known this moment was coming for weeks. The exchange, as reconstructed from the investigators' interviews and the court record, was short. Detective: Mr. Scar, we have a warrant for your arrest. We need you to come with us. Scar: I understand. Can I lock the office first? Detective: We'll walk you through it. Scar: The document at the bank. Is that what this is about? Detective: That's one of the things it's about. Scar: She was going to sign a release. I was going to put the money back. Detective: Sir, we're not going to have that conversation here. We're going to read you your rights and take you into the vehicle. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He did not deny the theft. He asked, at one point during the walk to the vehicle, whether they could avoid using the handcuffs in front of the neighbors on Lafayette Avenue. The detectives, in a small courtesy that no bystander would have noticed, waited until he was seated in the back of the vehicle to secure the restraints. The last words he said, before the door closed, were about his father. He asked whether anyone had called his mother. He was 53 years old. He had run the family business for 16 years. He had spent 10 of those years stealing from the customers whose parents his own father had once served as mayor. He was, in the moment the door closed, still primarily concerned that his mother should not learn about the arrest from the news. The confrontation, in the end, was not a confrontation. It was an acknowledgement. He had known for months that the investigation was closing in. He had known, in the moment he presented a forged death certificate to a bank representative on behalf of a living woman, that this ending was possible. He had chosen to do it anyway, and when it arrived, he did not fight it. He asked about his mother. He walked to the vehicle. He rode to the Ramapo Police Department. The plea would come 9 months later. On July 27, 2021, Leonard Allen Scarr appeared in Rockland County Court before Judge Larry J. Schwartz and entered a guilty plea. 2 counts of third-degree grand larceny, 1 count of second-degree forgery, 1 count of scheme to defraud. In exchange, the prosecution committed to its sentencing recommendation. The sentence would come 9 months later. Sentencing was held on March 2, 2022. Scarr was 54 years old. 3 victims addressed the court in person. 32 additional victims provided written impact statements. The most quoted statement came from a woman who had known Scarr for 30 years. She described him, on the record, as a dear friend. She reminded the court that Scarr had buried her father and many members of her husband's family. She had walked into his funeral home to arrange for her own funeral because she trusted him, because everyone in Suffern trusted him, because his father had been the mayor. And she stood in front of Judge Schwartz and told him that the trust she had placed in the 3rd generation of the Scarr family had been used to fund the daily life of a man who had known her and her family's grief for the entire adult lifespan of her relationship with the funeral home. Rockland County District Attorney Tom Walsh addressed the court and framed the case in the words that would appear in every local paper the following morning. Losing a loved one is one of the most challenging times in an individual's life, Walsh said. The defendant took advantage of these difficult situations the victims were in for his own personal gain. Judge Schwartz imposed the sentence: 2 to 6 years in New York State Prison, an indeterminate term, which under New York law meant that Scarr would become eligible for parole review after serving 2 years and could serve up to 6, depending on the parole board's judgment. Full restitution of $531,071.37. Paid. Per the civil forfeiture architecture, the Rockland County DA's office had established a year and a half earlier from the forfeiture proceeds and the sale of Scarr Funeral Home. The refund architecture worked exactly as the DA's office had designed it. Of the 89 identified victims, 23 elected to receive full refunds of their pre-need payments. All 23 were reimbursed by August of 2022. The remaining 64 to 66 elected to remain with the buyer of Scarr Funeral Home. That buyer was Edwards Funeral Chapel, which had purchased the century-old business as part of the civil forfeiture sale. Edwards committed to honor the contracted burial services the surviving pre-need customers had originally arranged with Scarr. Roughly $530,000 was set aside from the sale to fund the refunds and the honored contracts. The century-old family business, founded by his grandfather in 1920, run by his father through the 1980s, while his father served as the mayor of Suffern, and inherited by Leonard Scarr in 2004, was sold to close the case. The name on the stone above the door would be replaced. Edwards Funeral Chapel now serves the village. It will bury the residence Scarr's father had once served as mayor. It will bury the classmates Scarr had gone to Suffern High School with. It will bury the woman who called Leonard